Hi, my name is Tammy Medlin. I'm the local history librarian here at the Wilson County Public Library, and this is How and Why Women Struggle for the 19th Amendment. We're going to take a look at how women got the right to vote, why they needed it, and we're going to have a special focus on the struggle in North Carolina. In 1776, Abigail Adams wrote a letter to her husband John, who was with the Continental Congress, who had just declared independence from Great Britain. And she said, and I quote, "And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." John basically thought it was a joke. This is his reply. "As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. Depend upon it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Although they are in full force, you know they are little more than theory. We dare not exert our power in its full latitude. We are obliged to go fair and softly, and in practice, you know we are the subjects." However, he also goes on to talk about the despotism of the petticoat, and that if that happened, he would hope General Washington and all the brave heroes would fight. Well, what were Abigail and John talking about? It was something called Curvature, and it was the law in England, and it had been the law here in the colonies. And under Curvature, when a woman married, her legal identity disappeared. It merged with that of her husband, and her husband was the one in control. A married woman could not make a will, could not sign a contract, could not sue or be sued. Any property she had, even before the marriage, came under the control of her husband. It could even be seized for his debts, not hers, but his. And basically, unfortunately, this also became the law for the states. In 1848, in Seneca Falls, New York, they had the United States' first Women's Rights Convention, also called the Seneca Falls Convention. It was called by Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had met at the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London in 1840. However, even though Lucretia was a delegate, she wasn't permitted to speak. None of the female delegates were. It was unbecoming for women to speak in public. Out of this convention came what's called the Declaration of Sentiments. It was a list of abuses women had suffered under the law as it currently was, and a list of resolutions they wanted. The right to vote was listed as a grievance and as a resolution. Grievance, they didn't have it. Resolution, they were determined to get it. Susan B. Anthony was a teacher and abolitionist. She met Stanton in 1851, and they made a powerful team. In 1869, they formed the National Woman Suffrage Association, which became the National American Women's Association in 1890. Stanton wrote and Anthony gave speeches and lectures. Anthony brought attention to the cause when she was arrested in New York for voting in the presidential election in 1872. She was found guilty and fined $100. She never paid it. They didn't really push it because they didn't want her to be a martyr. Stanton raised ire when she wrote the Women's Bible in 1895 and 1898 in 2 volumes. Stanton and Anthony got an ally in Frances Willard when she became president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1879. It was the largest temperance organization in the United States, and they were for abstaining from alcohol. Willard made it so that women's suffrage was also in the group's platform. This got suffrage, a lot of women willing to follow it. The problem is, it made anybody who made their living from alcohol, anybody who owned a brewery, saloon, etc., against it. If you're wondering what the women were facing, this is a print from 1909. It's called Election Day. It shows the woman going off to vote, and the man holding two crying, screaming kids. If you look down in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see what looks like a vote ballot. And it basically says, the Hens Party. For President, Miss Henry Peck. For Vice President, Miss William Nagg. Although suffragists were often mocked, progress was being made. In 1869, Wyoming Territory gave women suffrage, and when they became a state in 1890, the women kept suffrage, which meant Wyoming was the first state to give women the right to vote. But Stanton and Anthony were getting older, and in 1900 they stepped down from the National American Woman Suffrage Association, and Carrie Chapman Catt became president. She served 2 terms, from 1900 to 1904 and 1915 to 1920. She developed a winning plan that had 2 stages. The association would campaign for suffrage on a state-by-state basis until they succeeded in 36. Those 36 states would then vote to ratify a national amendment. Usually, the association believed in petitions and lobbying, demure, quiet, ladylike protest. Sometimes that changed. In 1913, the National American Woman Suffrage Association held a parade down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. This is Inez Mulholland Bolsovane getting ready to ride down Pennsylvania Avenue to help lead the suffrage parade. It happened the day before President Wilson's inauguration to maximize publicity. If you've ever wondered why a lot of suffragists wore white when they're on parade, they wanted to stand out. They wanted to be seen. One of the organizers of the 1913 suffrage parade in D.C. was Alice Paul. Alice was a member of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and the parade was a success. But that same year, she came into conflict with Carrie Chapman Catt. Paul wanted to campaign on a national level and not state by state. She wanted a constitutional amendment. She was also more militant and left to form the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, later the National Woman's Party. Alice Paul did not believe in limiting herself to lobbying, petitions, and quiet, demure, ladylike behavior. She was definitely more in your face. She organized the Silent Sentinels. And from January 10th, 1917 to June 4th, 1919, the National Woman's Party picketed the White House 6 days a week in all types of weather. They were actually the first group to picket the White House. They stopped when Congress passed the Suffrage Amendment and sent it to the states for ratification. You may think they picketed the White House. Big deal. Well, the big deal was in April 1917, the United States entered World War I, and other associations stopped pushing for the vote, stopped protesting, and devoted themselves to the war effort. Not Alice Paul. They continued to protest, and the National Woman's Party even carried banners comparing President Wilson to Kaiser Wilhelm, the Kaiser of Germany. In November of 1917, some of the protesters were even arrested, and when they were put in jail, they even went on hunger strikes. This map, the victory map of 1917, shows how much things had changed and how far there was left to go. The states in white, women had full suffrage, and you can see the date they gained it listed in the state. Washington 1910, Wyoming 1869, Colorado 1893. In some of the other states, women could vote for the president, or they could vote in primary elections, or they could vote in municipal or local elections. But all the states in black, women had no right to vote in any election. And as you can see, a lot of those states were located in the South. Now we want to focus on the struggle in North Carolina. This is North Carolina timeline of women's rights. In 1776, when we declared independence from Great Britain, North Carolina based its laws on coverture. In 1868, we passed what's called a Married Women's Property Act, and it was written into the new state constitution. Other states had already done this. New York had done it as early as 1848. In 1897, a bill for women's suffrage was introduced to North Carolina, and was referred to the Committee on Insane Asylums. In 1913, the North Carolina Equal Suffrage League was formed. 1917, U.S. entered World War I. 1918, World War I ended, but 1918, we had the worldwide influenza epidemic. 1919, in June, Congress sends the 19th Amendment to the states for ratification, and in August 1920, North Carolina legislatures voted on the Suffrage Amendment. From the beginning, North Carolina had based its laws on coverture. Coverture was best explained by Walter Mackenzie Clark, Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court in 1913. He said, "Upon her marriage, the husband and the wife became one, and that one was the husband. He was the master. The wife was a non-entity. He compared the wife's status to that of a slave. If a woman worked for wages, her husband kept the pay. She had no control over her property, her money. She could not even make a will." By the 1840s, coverture was beginning to fall out of favor in a lot of states, including New York. They began to pass what were called married women's property laws. Basically, what most of these did was the husband kept control of the property, but he couldn't sell it, and it couldn't be seized for his debts. North Carolina did not pass one until 1868, after the Civil War. And this is what it said. Article 10, Section 6 of the North Carolina Constitution. The real and personal property of any female in this state acquired before marriage, and all property, real and personal, to which she may after marriage become in any manner entitled, shall be and remain the sole and separate estate and property of such female, and shall not be liable for any debts, obligations, or engagement of her husband's, and may be devised or bequeathed, and, with the written assent of her husband, conveyed as if she were unmarried. What that means was women could make wills again. They could leave land, they could leave other property to whom they chose. But they still really couldn't lease it or sell it. When a piece of property was conveyed, it involved a deed. And for that, a woman had to have her husband's written consent. So if she wanted to sell her property, her husband still had to sign before she could do so. She had to have his permission. The North Carolina Equal Suffrage League was organized in 1913, and it was associated with and favored the tactics of the National American Woman Suffrage Association and Carrie Chapman Catt, and frowned on those of Alice Paul and the National Woman's Party. The League was on record as saying they were opposed to any form of militancy and wanted to, quote, gain the vote by an appeal to reason and fair play. We'll see how that worked out in just a minute. Gertrude Weil, seen on the left, was state president when the amendment was passed in 1920. This photo shows the inside of League headquarters. League chapters were being formed all over the state, including here in Wilson. This ad is from the Wilson Times in 1919. It says the Wilson Equal Suffrage League will meet in the YMCA rooms Tuesday afternoon, March 18th at 4:30. This organization has only recently been formed, but it is hoped that its influence may be felt in no uncertain way during the coming months. The membership is growing, but we need the support of every intelligent woman of Wilson County. It also invited men to become honorary members. The reason things were coming to a head is President Wilson had changed his mind. Originally against women's suffrage, he came out in favor of it after World War I, due, he said, to women's participation in the war effort. By July 2nd, 1920, 35 states had ratified the Suffrage Amendment. Only one more was needed. Unfortunately, 8 states had rejected the amendment, and those states included Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Louisiana, as well as Mississippi, most of them being in the South. There were only 5 states who would be able to give the final vote. They included North Carolina, Tennessee, Florida, Connecticut, and Vermont. North Carolina and Tennessee both held special legislative sessions in August 1920 to consider the Suffrage Amendment. The North Carolina legislature went into session to consider the 19th Amendment on August 10, 1920. Governor Thomas Bickett was against suffrage, but he felt it was going to happen, so he felt North Carolina should, and I quote, accept the unavoidable and ratify the amendment. He made these comments when he introduced the legislation on August 13th. And by the way, his wife was in the room when he said that. The 19th Amendment was not going to have an easy time in North Carolina. On August 11th, members of the North Carolina House of Representatives sent the following telegram to the Tennessee legislature. We, the undersigned members of the House of Representatives of the General Assembly of North Carolina, constituting a majority of said body, send greetings to the General Assembly of Tennessee and assure you that we will not ratify the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, interfering with the sovereignty of Tennessee and other states of the Union. We most respectfully request that this measure be not forced upon the people of North Carolina. In other words, we're not going to vote for it. We would like it if you wouldn't either. Before the North Carolina House of Representatives could take up the amendment, it went to the Senate. Lindsey C. Warren was one of the chief opponents. When the Senate met on April 17th, Warren proposed that rather than vote on ratification, the issue should be postponed until the regular session in 1921. This idea passed, and the bill never even made it to the House. Rather than vote yes, or even vote no, they took the easy way out and put the amendment on the table. The Tennessee legislature was meeting at the same time as North Carolina to consider the 19th Amendment. The measure quickly passed in the Senate, but stalled in the House, where there was a motion to table it. That motion wound up in a tie, 48 to 48. Then the House decided to vote on the amendment itself, and it passed, 50 to 46. Tennessee was the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment and give women the right to vote. One story about this is about the legislator Harry Byrne, who was going to vote against suffrage, but received a message from his mother Phoebe, who told him to vote for suffrage and help Miss Cat put the rat in ratification. Gertrude Weil, head of the North Carolina Equal Suffrage League, summed up the situation with these words. As you know, our fight for ratification by the North Carolina legislature is over. We were unsuccessful in our efforts. Our North Carolina men have refused to ratify. We received the gift of political equality at the hands of men of other states.